like teed up that way.
And we just did a good primer.
Great.
Here, so.
Nathan Freitas and Valentin Weber. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, let's sit down and have a fun conversation. So,
Is this
thank you
just
so
sits
much
here?
for doing this. I appreciate it. But yeah, that just sits there, I think.
Do you have water?
I think.
Thank you.
The Chinese embassy gave us this and just said, put it everywhere, anytime you do an event, just put it there. So we have.
Yeah. I can tell you, I have stories about being paranoid about phones and technology that I can share.
Yeah, justifiable. Do you guys want to cue me or should we just kick it?
You are ready to go whenever you need.
Okay.
We're ready.
Well, I'm very excited for this conversation. We have two incredible experts with us, Nathan Freitas and Valentin Weber. A lot of people have read the book Chip Wars by Chris Miller. It's been very famous over the past year for taking readers through how semiconductors arrived at center stage in the great power competition between the US and China. But I'll confess I have a problem with the title. The title should really be Chip Battles. The larger conflict going on is a stack war, and the chip battle is just sort of one theater in that larger war. In the stack wars, what social media platform you use, which search engine, which cellular IoT module, which chip, which coding library, which telecom infrastructure, which satellites, which raw materials, they're all fronts in a raging conflict unfolding in the background as we speak. And what we're learning is that ideology can be embedded in technology, and along with more explicit malware, surveillance, and espionage systems, and ultimately control, that ideology can be embedded. Moreover, as we've discovered in our work on the Select Committee on China, as the CCP perfects its tech stack for surveillance at home and espionage abroad, technologies from Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, and other Chinese smart city technologies are forming a type of authoritarianism starter kit for other repressive regimes that are seeking to control their population. So in this stack war, we need to make clear that the American tech stack represents and indeed encodes basic human rights. I want to acknowledge before we get into the conversation that this is a very difficult problem. We want American technology companies to be able to compete in as many global markets as possible, but in order to do that, we realize these companies need to respect the laws of the different jurisdictions in which they operate. And that's not an easy task, and it's amazing that so many American multinational corporations manage it. However, in extreme situations, there must be lines that American companies do not cross, particularly when it comes to foreign laws that are so antithetical to baseline American values that they can't be followed, or pressure from governments that's so unjust that American companies simply can't comply. So when do you tip over from respecting a country's laws to becoming an accessory to tyranny? That's sort of the dilemma we're trying to grapple with. And demarcating in advance where these lines are isn't easy. And today I'm lucky to have a few experts with me to help us on the committee grapple with that very difficult question. Because when you run a social media site, a career networking site, a search engine, or an app store, you aren't just selling screws or widgets. You're selling a product that is entwined with the fabric of civil society wherever you are. You're going to be held to a higher standard, I think, than someone who's selling coffee. And a good rule of thumb, I think, would be that we do not become reliant on the good graces of a genocidal communist regime for the production of our most important products. So I want to close my overly long intro here by saying that when asked about techno-optimism, Steve Jobs famously said, "It's not faith in technology, it's faith in people." But what happens when there are groups of people, like the Chinese Communist Party, who we should not have any faith in, that are controlling the technologies? That's the question. So I want to welcome our experts. First, we have Nathan Freitas. Nathan, why don't you tell our hundreds of thousands of viewers who you are?
Thanks so much, Representative. I am Nathan Freitas of the Guardian Project, an organization I founded 15 years ago that was founded with a sister organization called the Tibet Action Institute. These two halves of who I am represent my work as a technologist and as an activist. And I've been involved in the Tibet freedom and independence movement for almost 25 years. In 2004, I went to Tibet, went to China, doing work to connect prisoners who had fled Tibet and to seek asylum, nuns who had protested and then been exiled, to reconnect them with their families. And I've experienced this oppression of the Tibetan people firsthand, and alongside that have had a long career with cybersecurity. I worked for the Palm Pilot Trio company for a long time, so mobile phones and technology are at my core. I was one of the first developers on the BlackBerry software, the BlackBerry device, and have continued that work to today. So I care deeply both personally and also technologically about what you said, encoding values into tech. When I was 7 or 8, I was fortunate in Northern California to be at a school where Apple donated Apple II computers. And we had an after-school coding club. And I learned how to program BASIC on a Apple II computer, string variables, for loops, all these great things. And you could make that computer do anything you want. You could take a floppy disk and put in any code you want that you could get from anybody. You had that freedom with the Apple II. And it's made me sad over the years to see how Apple now sells a hermetically sealed appliance that can only do what the government of the place that's selling it allows it to do. And I really want Apple to get a little bit back to that Apple II culture. So that's who I am.
Great. Well, we look forward to digging into that. We also have Valentin Weber. Valentin, why don't you tell, again, our throngs of viewers and listeners who you are.
Thank you so much, Representative. I'm Valentin Weber. I'm a senior research fellow with the German Council on Foreign Relations, which is a foreign policy think tank in Berlin. But throughout my research, I have been often in the United States. I was an Open Technology Fund fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, where I looked into comparing the Russian and the Chinese models of information control. And that was a couple years ago. And what we've seen in the last few years is that the Russian model is getting much more to what China is today. So China is really having such an impact globally. And I was always kind of intrigued by the global footprint that the Chinese surveillance state and also the industrial complex that's has been built in a couple of years is having across the world from Nigeria to Argentina to Europe and to the Middle East. It's really everywhere, and so that's what my research was mostly focused on seeing how the Chinese surveillance state has evolved through the last 2 decades.
Great. Perfect. All right. Well, as you can see, we have 2 actual experts. I just play one on TV. I'm not actually one. So maybe let's start with sort of a basic question for you, Nathan, like to baseline this whole thing. What does online censorship look like in China today?
Where it is today, I'll wind back to where it was kind of in the Great Firewall era, because we moved way beyond that, right? So at one point, you had ideas of keyword filtering. You can't type certain words into a search engine. Host names, where certain websites would be blocked when you tried to find how to connect to them on the internet. Pretty simple. That was the area where kind of Cisco powered a lot of this censorship, unfortunately. So we have a history there already from the earliest days of American companies, just having another customer, right? The evolution of that then moved into something called like deep packet inspection, where we started building technologies, many funded by the US government and others. US Navy Research Lab created the Tor protocol, for instance. And Tor basically helps secure the internet and get around people breaking it like China was doing. And so through things like Tor and other circumvention technology, activists in China and journalists and anyone really were able to get around those basic blocks. Then the cat and mouse game began, where deep packet inspection was used. So instead of just looking at kind of the headers of the information, new technology, faster processors, more sophisticated routers, could then actually look at every packet in every shape and say, this looks like a Skype protocol. This looks like a download. This looks like, oh, we haven't seen this server before. Let's take a closer look. This was all automated in real time, but backed by hundreds, thousands of people, right, who could sort of power that system. The next step then beyond that has, as the world had moved from the web to apps, has been app-level control and censorship, right? So inside of WeChat, inside of Weibo, censorship that's integrated into these companies' infrastructure and surveillance. And so that is now moved on along with things like the social credit score and things that Valentin can talk about, where it's not just what you're doing on the internet, but sort of your whole digital life is now monitored and surveilled and measured and controlled. So that increasing of speed and processor and ability in real time to decide whether a packet should go in or out has really come a long way. And so the overriding thing I want you all to feel is the idea of fear, that chilling effect, that now you can't even try to go to a website. You shouldn't install that app on your phone because they'll know you've installed this app.
Interesting.
So that really, and the gentle nudging towards authoritarianism online that China keeps pushing and pushing and pushing has led people to just be so afraid that they'll just use WeChat and that's it.
Yeah. I think when our legions of fact checkers can fact check me on this. When Bill Clinton was making the case for China's accession to the WTO, he had a line in a speech he gave, possibly addressing Congress, where he said, good luck trying to keep the internet out. That'd be like nailing Jell-O to a wall. Right, which gets us this core assumption we make, which is like internet connectivity is going to bring people together and information is going to flow and good things will happen. But it does seem like they figured out a way to nail Jell-O to the wall and turn the internet into a apparatus for total party control, which of course is the goal. Maybe Nathan react to that, and then Valentin, you can expand upon that if you want. Yeah.
The internet was designed without a lot of security and privacy, unfortunately. And the need for that to ensure free access was not considered, and some believe that was done so that you could surveil on the internet, that everyone wanted that backdoor, essentially. So there's a balance here between saying, how was the internet designed before? A lot of what you said, people's belief that the internet could route around anything was a bit of a myth. But there was kind of an anti-feature design into the internet that broke it early on, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's intriguing. When around the time when Bill Clinton said that statement, a lot of what we see today wasn't yet possible. But the interesting thing is that the Chinese Communist Party already had a vision of how things should be. They already wanted to build a all-encompassing surveillance state. So they launched something called the Golden Shield Project in 1998, which should be, in the first stage, really to digitize all of the police systems that were there, all the records that were kept throughout the years. And then they started to add geolocation to police vehicles, and that really also propelled the surveillance state. But the point I would like to get across is that in the beginning it was all about information control. It was about Weibo, WeChat, all the social media platform, and it still is because people still have their social media there on the platforms. But in the early days, it was like you posted something that authorities didn't like, and your account would be blocked, right? But if you do it today, that same account would mean that you wouldn't be able to leave the city, because what you're doing online is having an impact on your offline world, because you would walk with your phone and you just would have to scan your face or scan a QR code to take a train to a neighboring city.
Yeah.
But because you posted something online, the authorities would limit your freedom of movement. So what was in the beginning information control is now physical control.
My understanding is that this sort of increased exponentially during the COVID-0 lockdowns, right? Like, what was the system with which you had to show a pass for basic access to a grocery store or things like that? Maybe enlighten us as to how that works.
So you had, there were 3 colored code, and maybe I think Nathan is much better suited to give this answer, but depending on the color you'd get, it would give you either the ability to move around or you'd be restricted. But Nathan, maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, I can say that there was globally a lot of the same idea related to COVID, and like motivated by like, we need to track, you know.
We need to process trace our way out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Was that the phrase?
Yeah. My wife is
contact trace. Sorry, process trace. Yeah. Process trace, I think, is a political science term that I'm now remembering from my failed academic career.
And the way China implemented was very predictable and powered and easy to turn on based on the other systems already in place, right? And they already had a culture of QR codes. They already had a system for facial recognition. All of the tech there, and there's no regulations to stop it. In the US, we actually had a pretty active debate and feedback around, as much as Google and Apple wanted to quickly move to do contact tracing and to turn it on for everyone, there was pushback, and you could turn it off, and it wasn't automatically enabled. And in cases where it was, I think there's lawsuits now saying, well, you shouldn't have done that because that goes too far. Europe also had some of these issues relating to, should this be open code? Should we all, should it be open source code when it comes to these sorts of systems? So in this case, yeah, China took the opportunity, the space, to ramp up systems that we'd been worried about for quite a long time, and that we had only seen applied to the Uyghur Muslim population, right, in Xinjiang. Tibetans hadn't seen it yet. Uyghurs had already had what I call the police state app, which I think Human Rights Watch of others has researched on. Essentially, rather than having to surveil just from the network, like the mobile carrier, you just put an app on someone's phone, like many people experience with their employers in the US, where they can kind of see everything you're doing. The state now required physical app presence on your phone, right?
Interesting.
And so it's just an extension of something that had been tested on the Uyghurs and then expanded.
Yeah. Which gets to, I think one of the core questions I have as I examine what the CCP is doing internally to its own people, and certainly the horrors that we're seeing in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, is whether this is just a mechanism for internal control and total party control, or to what extent they are perfecting a model that could be exported to other countries. And I'd be curious to invite your thoughts on that. I don't know who to start with, but
you have a case that you brought up earlier, but I'll briefly say that in our work at Guardian Project, where we're working communities in Latin America, Central Asia, and Africa, all of the new infrastructure is Huawei and other Chinese 4G upgrades. Increasingly, new phones on the market are Chinese phones that don't have the Google Play infrastructure, software on them. And so, that goes along very evenly with the timeline for an increased capability of internet shutdowns and restrictions in these places. So I think we're now in the phase to do that research and tie those things together. But I know Valentin is great at research. So.
Yeah. So it is. I've just been fascinated by this research. It's first of all about really domestic security. We see that the spending of the PRC on domestic security is even larger than on their military. So that's really their highest priority, to stay in power. And they have been perfecting it over the years. It's almost a scientific and algorithmic governance that they have started imposing. And it's chilling, because even when there's this smallest uprising or the smallest dissent, they would know immediately. And technological capabilities have enabled them to do so. We have much higher processing power today. There's systems today that can scan 100 million faces in a matter of 10 seconds, or hours of video footage in just minutes. And so that really empowers the party and will likely increase the likelihood for them to stay and perpetuate their rule, because it's just becoming really. It's also saving them costs, If you have AI process massive amounts of data, you don't need so many people to review the footage. And that's kind of saving the cost as well for the surveillance state. But looking abroad, it's also quite chilling because we see Chinese surveillance equipment in basically every country, smallest to the largest. We have Huawei Safe Cities, which is their branded name, Safe Cities, in Nairobi, then we have it in Uganda, all across the world. And we can really see also a strong industry within China. The company is pushing it out because they want to make money, right, from surveillance products. And so they're pushing it out into the world. And where is that leading us? I think it really becomes worrying when, because the CCP is propping up friendly regimes with the surveillance equipment abroad. We've recently seen that in Afghanistan, where Huawei is extending and building the CCTV network within Afghan cities, and is thereby really propping up the Taliban regime there. And something similar is happening in a variety of authoritarian countries across the world, where Chinese technology is making friendly regimes stay longer in power, and also make it much more difficult then for political dissent to arise there. We've done technical research with a colleague of mine. We've been tracking Huawei middle boxes across the world. Those are used to surveil and to censor content. So we've seen how, we've seen cases through our technical research, how those middle boxes have been censoring content, LGBT content in Oman, or also shut down websites in Burundi, that were giving kind of free opinion, but that weren't aligning with the political elites' opinions. So we can really see how Huawei technology is also enabling censorship abroad.
It seems to me you kind of have two potential partners or clients of the CCP when it comes to technology. You have authoritarian regimes or monarchical regimes for whom human rights may not be a top concern, and many of these may actually be close allies of the United States for geopolitical security purposes. But you also have countries that are just struggling economically in Latin America or Africa, who just don't have the luxury of thinking about the counterintelligence implications of having your entire infrastructure built by Huawei, right? All you care about is price. And I had this when we were going around the world in the Trump administration. I was in Congress, I was not in the administration. But as the administration was going around the world, trying to make the case for a Huawei and ZTE ban, which was pretty effective at the time. And some of our closest allies were considering these fraught mitigation agreements, the UK foremost among them. What we were never able to say is like, okay, Huawei is bad, and here is our alternative, free world alternative that can compete on cost with Huawei. Because we obviously just can't subsidize state champions to the same level that they can. I mean, push back if you think I'm totally off-base. Yeah. Well, I guess what's the solution to that?
Well, here's where I'll give a shout out to the Open Technology Fund, which brought us here today, and a lot of the other US government funded and European government funded internet freedom programs. There's a strong goal there to have free and open source software solutions. This is what, if you look at what most technology is actually built on today, is the Linux operating system, which is free and open source software. And Android is built on Debian Linux. And there are, that is one model that has really been successful in countries where you need an economic alternative to a commercial license. Now, in the case of Huawei and infrastructure, they do participate in international standards bodies. They go to these meetings. They want to be accepted on the world stage. And I think that's where there can be pressure through things like message layer security, which is a global standard for doing what Signal does, basically, but in text messaging everywhere, right? There's the RCS system that Google's been really pushing, say, Apple to adopt. That has encryption built in. So there's ways to, create standards, create pressure, create free and open alternatives like Linux, and free and open app stores like one that we built called F-Droid, that can compete on price, essentially, because then what you're talking about is not paying for software licenses, but you're paying to do skill building in areas and build careers for people. The other thing that we've been working on quite a bit, especially for places like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, is alternate internet infrastructure. So in the news, you might hear about Elon Musk and starry satellites and things like this, Starlink, actually. There's a lot of other work in communities that either don't have connections or where the internet's very expensive or where the internet's surveilled or being shut down. And so there's work we do building off-grid internet solutions, peer-to-peer networks, mesh networks between mobile phones. As I often say, our phones are supercomputers.
Yeah.
They can do so much. They have like a Bluetooth radio, an NFC radio, Wi-Fi radios, LTE radios. If they were sort of open to do anything you'd want, each of those phones could be a server that could broadcast information, right? So there are ways to compete when it comes to providing free access. There is work being done with using spare satellite channels to beam information into Iran, for instance. There's work we've done with sneaker nets in Cuba and providing free content access to information there for activists. So there's the one way of competing by creating an alternative market, pressuring with international standards, and then supporting tools for activists and journalists and others.
A quick follow-up on your point about pressure that could be applied in international fora. This, to me, assumes that we show up in these fora, that we have an active presence. And one thing I'm reminded of, I think it happened 2 years ago, there was a question as to who would lead the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is something I can guarantee you very few, if any, members of Congress are paying attention to. And it just happened to come across my radar screen thanks to a former colleague of mine, Jim Langevin, who was a leader on cybersecurity issues. And basically, at the time, had we taken no action, the Chinese would have dictated who sort of ran the organization, which would have been incredibly problematic. And I fear as there's this sort of neo-isolationist sentiment in both parties, it might lead us to retrench from these sort of multilateral institutions that are quite important for setting the standards that you
Absolutely. I'll give you another example. We're directly working with UNICEF right now on trying to evaluate the global solutions and standards for civil registration and vital statistics. This is how you do birth and death registration digitally around the world.
Interesting.
And this obviously has a huge potential threat model, bad actors, people using the data. And we're part of a process engaging with global standards on how to do this, how to do it securely. And the threats we come up with are much more radical and severe than what anyone else has thought of, because we've been through this. We know how it can go wrong. And I think at all of these standards bodies, there isn't that kind of thinking. Like, wow, isn't this a great, cool tech feature we can add for a lot of the stuff we see with phone tracking came about because in the GSM standard, there's a way to track stolen phones, right? There's a way to block stolen phones. That sounds like a nice feature, right? But you could take that and use it to turn phones off, to track phones, to get, even the ability to, GSM has encryption, but you can turn it off and you won't know.
Yeah.
Someone could roll up outside of your window with a rogue cell tower base station, and your phone can just connect to it without encryption. You wouldn't know. So a lot of these things are thought of by people that don't have the proper mindset. The way you were talking about, battles and wars and stacks and campaigns sounds like a better mindset that we need.
I don't know, Valentin, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's really crucial is we need to understand what's happening today and where things are going. One trend, for instance, is data fusion, where the police would look at hotel booking confirmations. They would add license plate recognitions to it, facial recognition, and add all that up to make sense of people and to create super powerful surveillance measures. So I think that's really crucial for us to understand and to have research on it, because the state doesn't publish it. There's nothing that would give any indication to that. And the second, I think, is, or even to tell digital rights defenders or to share the knowledge about how to move through a smart city. If on every corner there's a CCTV camera, and if there's hidden surveillance measures of which you don't even know, right? Mm-hmm. Just being careful of where you surf is not enough, or what you do online. And the second, I think, is to also enable parliamentarians across the world. I've been in various continents to speak to parliamentarians and to raise awareness as to the local surveillance projects, Chinese surveillance projects that are happening in their country, and often they don't even know. But once they know, there's pushback. We've seen that in the Philippines on national security grounds. They've been pushing back against smart cities, and in other places as well. In Mauritius, there have been discussions in the parliament about Huawei safe cities. So I think that's also really crucial to raise awareness and to highlight the diffusion of the technology, because often it just goes under the radar and people don't know about it.
Yeah, I want to discuss and dig into the role and responsibility that American companies have that I alluded to before. And maybe to frame this, go back to the pandemic or post-pandemic more recently, and the COVID-0 protests that we saw in China, the biggest protest since Tiananmen. I had this thought that one of the biggest differences between Tiananmen and the COVID-0 protests is that the CCP regime has many more instruments at its disposal technologically to suppress dissent today than it did back during the Tiananmen massacre. And one question that still lingers to this day is why Apple AirDrop functionality was shut down during the protests. I guess A, do you have a theory on that particular incident? And if not, B, sort of, let's start with Apple, which is an incredible story of American innovation and success, and just, all of us have Apple products. Where do they draw the line in terms of their massive operation in China? If that makes sense, I don't know who to start with.
So in our work at Tibet Action Institute, we've been pressuring Apple through with shareholders and other human rights organizations to live up to a human rights statement they published a few years ago. One key aspect of that is demanding more transparency around these specific kind of events, policies, rules, controls. The primary issue with Apple in China is we don't know exactly what they're doing and when they're doing it. Not only are they complying, and we feel overly complying with the local laws of China, they're doing so without notification, with sort of minimal reporting. So as an example, we know through testing and through research like Valentin's and others that Apple iMessage encryption is disabled or doesn't, messages now as they call it, doesn't work the same in China as it works elsewhere. But we have to sort of black box test to figure that out. We know that in certain regions in China, FaceTime will work, in other regions it won't. We know based on sovereign data laws and the Chinese sort of cybersecurity laws, iCloud data is for Chinese users, or if you have a Chinese SIM card, is hosted in mainland China, not encrypted, versus hosted outside of China for the rest of us. We have to sort of pick apart these things. The primary area where they've complied is the App Store, censorship and removal of apps. Over 50,000 apps, primarily VPN apps, anti-censorship tools, including tools that I help develop. I deal with this every day directly, and I have to sort of decipher the Byzantine and complex and opaque messages I get from Apple. This app is in violation of a policy. Which policy? A policy. You just go back and forth. They don't even help you know what you've done most of the time. And so your question is, what happened there? Why did AirDrop get disabled at this crucial time? Was it Apple that complied? Looking at this long history of Apple complying in a way that with the regulations of the Chinese Communist Party, I'd have to say yes. Based on that, they must have complied at that time. Did they have other reasons to disable the way AirDrop worked? yes, there's a lot of problems with AirDrop. There's people using it to spam others with terrible, hate speech and pornographic material because it was kind of designed in a little way that people can make a mistake and be too open to strangers, basically. But they use that to say, well, we better lock it all down then, right? And so I would say, Apple repeatedly has not been able to stand up to pressure from China. And we've tried to, again, using shareholders, using experts, using human rights activists, using testimony and pressure, get them to at least be more transparent as a first step. And then beyond that, be more creative. But on your question, we just need to know what happened.
Yeah.
And why do they feel, it's one thing to comply, it's another thing to try to cover it up.
Is the core of their dilemma, not that I pretend to know what goes on at Apple headquarters, just their supply chain is sort of exquisitely built in China, and it's, even though they might desire genuinely to sort of rebalance and expand their presence in India, that's a 10 to 15 year project at the earliest. I mean, would that be their rejoinder? I mean, if they were being honest, would that be their response, or?
Yes, in the sort of highly integrated way in which their hardware and software and services and stack is delivered, right?
Interesting.
So Android phones are also largely built in China, but who builds them and the operating system and how they get delivered and how at the core Android is more open, more kind of Wild West, means you don't have that level of unified control. Apple is the only one with unified control. And that they've built that vertical stack, which is a great business, but it's a perfect instrument for the Chinese Communist Party to then guide and control. And they have this very engineer mindset about comply with local law, check. Yes, we must. That's it, right? And that's the most frustrating thing of what about complying with the International Declaration of Human Rights? What about, your values, right? And so that stack also has a great deal of power. But it is partly the supply chain, but again, other approaches to delivering these portable supercomputers we all have ended up with a more free system. I'll also point out that on your MacBook computer, you can run any software you want. There isn't this totalitarian control like there is on the phone and the tablet. And it's a weird divide that you can download an app from the internet on your Mac and hit right-click and say, open and run, fine. But you can't do that on an iPhone or an iPad when they're all running the same chips. They're basically all the same thing. One just has a keyboard.
Yeah.
So Apple also has these strange dividing lines of control where the phone and the tablet must be fully controlled. This is a computer, but what is a computer, right? Yeah. What is a phone? So we need to just shake them up a bit.
I'll invite Valentin to comment on that and maybe pose another question for you or both of you. Are there examples of good actors in this space, leading American technology companies that you think have struck the right balance? Because we're not, at the end of the day, we're not asking Apple to be the State Department, but these are American companies. I'm not sure they think of themselves that way sometimes, but we want them to abide by American values in some sense. Are there good models in this area that we could build upon and not just sort of keep poking the bad actors? If that makes sense. Yeah.
I'll just finish something on the Apple on the thing, and then I'll hand you back for the good actors. But I just want to put it into perspective as well, because even if you're fully compliant as Apple is, whether it comes to encryption of cloud data or taking down of apps, it still doesn't guarantee you the benevolence of the CCP. We've seen that recently with the banning of iPhones for party members, right? So even there, I think if you're fully at the knees of the authorities.
Can you explain this? How should we interpret this as an attempt to privilege a domestic, I guess it'd be like a Huawei device, competitor over Apple, or what should our hundreds of thousands of viewers understand about this move?
Yeah, so there are laws in China which say that no foreign equipment should be used within facilities or by people who are that's related to national security. So that's relates to operating systems or other solutions, but often it's very difficult to implement that because foreign products are performing better, or there is, it's difficult to get the full clean slate. And it might be that the phones are at a stage, domestic phone producers are at a stage where now it's possible to substitute them with iPhones, and it's also maybe a sign towards the US in saying, okay, we are also cracking down even more. But Nathan, what's your take, or especially on the good actors, which I have
your take, and then good actors, yeah.
Well, yeah, the comment that the quality of Chinese domestic mobile phones and computing and services in general has skyrocketed. I mean, you get the most interesting phones, beautiful phones. I mean, I think we'd all be blown away with what is available in the Chinese market. So the idea that the Apple used to be this luxury good there, and everyone wanted it, and that's, it may come to a point where the actual consumer market in China, as big as it is, isn't as important to Apple as it once was. I will also say, I mean, in so many ways, Apple is a good actor. I mean, they have built an amazing device that is extremely secure on many fronts. I mean, their system of control means you have if someone who is severely targeted, at risk, yourself, others, ask me, what should I get? I would say iPhone, right? Because that is an American product built with encryption and been audited and has the best track record for software updates. There's many good things about it. But I'll also then point out the idea of what Android and what Google did with that. When I started building software, human rights, internet freedom software for phones, it was before the Android era, really. And you had the BlackBerry, you had some Nokia phones, Java phones. In China, there was about 30.
I've heard about these ancient instruments.
Flip phones with tiny little screens.
My parents have told me.
I know. There were so many different operating systems in China. You couldn't really build an app that would run on a phone there. You couldn't build a tool for an activist that would help them do airdrop-like functionality. It just wasn't possible. Android wiped that market out, right? Everyone overnight adopted Android, which was built by Google, and opened up that world for all of us to deliver functionality to anyone, anywhere in the world on a $50 phone. Like, this was groundbreaking. And it really has made our work with building tools that get around censorship, that allow people to access news and information, that allow people to organize safely, possible. So, in terms of good actors, Open Technology Fund, the State Department's Internet Freedom Support, these actually supported the creation of Signal, which everyone pretty much knows now is like the gold standard for encrypted communication on your phone. The encryption that Signal has created, open source, was then adopted by WhatsApp. And when that happened, I emailed Moxie Marlinspike, who created Signal, and said, you did it. 1 billion people now have private text messaging around the world. And WhatsApp has actually been really good, Meta, at standing up to people. I mean, their head of their Brazil office was arrested because they wouldn't comply with local laws. And that standard, and Google has adopted this for RCS, sort of Signal's work there, being open source and a tool that others could implement, has sort of permeated throughout the world and created something that I wasn't sure I would see in my life. Easy, universal encrypted texting. Beyond that, the cloud providers like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, these are, again, American companies that have provided amazingly powerful cloud computing infrastructure that anyone can tap into. And one of the programs we work on is helping Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America remain online and uncensored in places like Russia, right, or places like China. And a lot of the solutions we have there, we're able to scale up and be nimble and do all sorts of dynamic things because we have these compute clouds. And it's really interesting that when the invasion of Ukraine began, Russia would kind of update their censorship about once a month. And then it became once a week, and then once a day. And now every 6 hours, they block us and we have to unblock ourselves. And we can do it, right? We can keep doing that. And And they get these notices from like the Russian internet authority saying, hey, this server on your network is doing something we don't like. And Amazon like forwards them to us and they say, here you go, we'll just ignore this, you know. And so in fact, having the powerful compute clouds on our side is a huge deal. And they're not always our best friends, but there's a lot that we've been able to do, and the power those companies have is great. So there's a few examples. I could go on, but I think, you know, this idea that, I guess the last story, and this ties into the future a little bit with AI and large language models. I was also a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, shout out. And before COVID, there was a whole working group on AI in China. And the thought was, China is dominating in AI. They're way ahead of us. They're hiring all the experts. They're just going to kill us. Turns out they were mostly just building on research from Google. They didn't have any of their own breakthroughs. And now we know the breakthroughs have really come from OpenAI, from Google's work with Palm, Facebook, and Llama. We are the heart of this terrifying but powerful technology.
Yeah.
And again, like, that's impressive. And these are companies in our country that need to have this idea of ethics baked in, because I'm already concerned there about, you know, what could happen with these tools in the future related to censorship.
On that point, though, I do think I think part of the perception in Congress, maybe at least in my party, is that the median tech worker at Google, or take your pick of one of these companies, is like hostile to, let's say, national security, right? And I think a lot of this is a hangover from the Maven incident at Google. I mean, do you think that's overblown? You know, you're in that world. I mean, you know, take us into that a little bit.
I think each country is very different.
Yeah.
Amazon Web Services has a huge number of government contracts and infrastructure, and it's wild the kind of things they do with data storage, secure data storage, semi-trucks of data, working with various organizations. And Google is quite different, and they've evolved over time.
Yeah.
You know, again, I think and Microsoft has a long history of working with the U.S. government on various projects. I would say there was this naive culture for a long time about both the good they thought they were all doing, and the fear of like supporting working with governments. And I think, you know, the problem most likely that I saw from those types of middle people was that they weren't informed and they weren't engaged, and it was sort of, again, there wasn't transparency about like, this is our mission and this is why we're doing it. I think they all want to believe in this kind of techno-utopian vision where they don't have to worry about those things, and they're just building their great products that will, as opposed to really engaging in the messy, dirty work that we're in all the time. And so there's a different way of approaching these things and saying, like, you know, people ask us all the time, like, oh, you do like, you know, Tor and Signal, but you take US government funding? Like, yeah, here it is on my website. Like, here's the grants we're a part of, and this is my reports, and everything Open Technology Fund supports is transparent on their website.
Yeah.
It's like, those are my tax dollars. This is a good thing. This is why I'm doing it, for like support democracy, support security, support the rights of people around the world. And I think if you just change that culture from the sort of techno-utopianism startup world that I fled 20 years ago, and get those people out in the world a little more, we'll have a better conversation. But I think the change has to come. The change is happening from the bottom at these companies, but not yet from the top, in terms of how they're engaging with the teams that actually have to work on this stuff, and to make sure they understand the reasons why.
You know, we talked a lot about Apple and Google. We mentioned Microsoft in passing. My sense is Microsoft does generally want to work with the government and wants to do more. At the same time, you know, I've had disagreements with them over them wanting to sell Windows products for use on Huawei hardware, Windows software for use on Huawei hardware. Just give me a sense of, like, what do I need to know? What does someone need to know about Microsoft in this space?
I mean, there was the whole thing of, financial games was where they put their money in Europe, and creating different havens for data. So I would say they're huge companies and they have different groups with different goals. I think Microsoft is also evolving. They moved away from the almighty, like selling a license to Windows, to being a cloud company. And so I think the evolution there is looking more like the Apple issue of where's your cloud infrastructure? How are you being transparent about surveillance? If you put a Azure cloud data center in Beijing or Shanghai, what does that mean? What happens to the data there? Yeah. So a lot of their culture has evolved quite a bit. And again, they're the main financial backer behind OpenAI, and so that's a whole other topic. Sure. So the era of, the Windows license salesperson is kind of done, and that culture was just make a buck any way I can. Now, I think again they're starting to have the same problems Apple does, really. Yeah. And as opposed to Google, who's sort of put their foot down and said, yeah, we're not going to go into China. Yeah. Facebook. Yeah. Microsoft is dabbling more.
Yeah. In the minutes we have left, and we'll start with you, Valentin, let's talk solutions. With the caveat that, as today's events show, it's not easy to get anything done in Congress. If you could wave a magic wand and force us to do certain things legislatively to put the United States and our allies in a better position to win this, what I've called a stack war, let's just call it a technological competition with the CCP, what would be on your list of things?
Yeah, so I would say regarding surveillance, smart cities are a big topic now, and it's a lot about market share in different continents, and I think the Chinese companies have been very good at providing a turnkey solution to cities. They would say, we're selling your product, and it's all-inclusive. Surveillance, increasing efficiency, water management, electrical grid, all that the smart city encompasses. But the primary branding has been safe cities, because there is a lot of crime in especially less developed countries. And so I think where we or also Western companies would have to do more is to provide such an integrated product of smart cities, of course, by providing an alternative with privacy technologies, enhance and somehow maintaining anonymity in these in cities, right? Providing an alternative to Chinese smart cities where all the data ends up with the state, and so at the same time we have to prevent it. All the data ends up with the companies, right? So it should be really a good kind of because that has been also kind of the critical point about, let's say, products from Google, right? That's why the Toronto project was called off, because the citizens of Toronto didn't feel comfortable having all their data shared with Google. So I think that's a concern that needs to be kind of mitigated, right? To say, okay, China is bad because of the state, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of concerns, that there's these companies which are driven also by accumulating their data. So I think that needs to be kind of mitigated to be able to compete on a global stage.
Great. Nathan, you have the magic wand now. You get to force Congress.
Well, first I just want to sort of invoke my Tibetan colleagues, our Uyghur allies, Chinese Christian partners, Chinese activists, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese who, again, love Apple products, understand the security, the capability. The iPhone was the first phone to support Tibetan text, reading and writing, in this, language that's at risk, right, from the world, because it's being, Tibetan kids are being sent off to boarding schools and not learning how to read and write it. It wasn't supported in digital devices until the iPhone. Apple's can and do great things. The things that Tibet Action and others have called on them to do is, again, be more transparent. So Congress demanding that when companies comply, when they feel they're forced or compelled to comply with the laws of other countries, that they have maximum transparency around what they've done and why and when. A change log that shows the changes made, and not that we have to sort of go and poke a black box to figure out what's happened. The second is the kind of work around again, engagement and living up to a bunch of the statements they've already made publicly. We could go through those later, but they've stated what they would like to do. Somehow it feels like they don't have the will, they don't have the cover, they don't have the support to kind of live up to that on a global stage. So that's more of a partnership approach, and to say, look, we believe in you. This sounds good. Let's figure out how you can do it. I think on the last piece, technologically, they've created this amazing stack and product and technology that, again, as I opened, I love. Back to the Apple II, it still has that magic for me. But they're so boxed in themselves in this kind of system of control. And so that's where, say, the European Commission is pushing on them to say, you should allow third-party app stores. You should have these toggles. You should have the ability for someone to say, I don't want you to control that part of my digital life, and open this supercomputer up to do anything you want. And so that's where pressure and laws can actually push them to require that. And EU's going that way. I think we can also go that way. And then that gives them that sort of, again, the cover that Android already has, because Android allows you to have third-party app stores and side loading and things like this, which could re-enable then features like AirDrop, if they can just get the right piece of software on the phone. So I think it's a mixture of pressure and partnership, and to have them live up to, the great company they are and brilliant people they are, to understand their role in the global situation.
Quick lightning round. TikTok, ban, force sale, do nothing.
Banning apps is a slippery slope that leads us to the place where China is now. So no ban.
No ban. I regret asking this question.
Limiting usage for public officials and for anything that's public, right? For the bureaucracy, for government. But when it's about citizens and private decisions, then that should be left with them, right? Similar with 5G. Okay, anything that's a public network, there's not such an issue of getting it out because it's a national security issue. But if it's somewhere in a state, a citizen that wants to run their own, Chinese home router, then that's not such a big issue. So I think I would make the distinction between private and public decisions.
I would note for the record, for all the hand-wringing, I understand your slippery slope argument over a ban or a forced sale and control the algorithm and all this. As a matter of reciprocity, our tech apps, social media apps are not allowed in China. So I'm throwing that out there just for the public record. Okay, this is my final question. I know we're running over time here. Okay, my grandma is 96. Virginia Justice is her name. By the way, imagine if my last name was Justice. I would be president at this point. And when I was in the Marine Corps, I would have been Captain Justice. Gosh. Well, Gallagher's not bad, I guess. She's a very tech-savvy lady. Why should she care about any of this? Explain why any of this matters in non-tech jargon terms. Who wants to start? Yeah.
Easy pass.
Well, I have a mother who's almost that old.
Wow.
And I mean, she understands what a computer is. A computer is a thing that should do what she wants it to do.
Yeah.
She bought it. She paid for it. She wants to put the software on to do our family biography, and she has the disk and should put it in and it works. My mom loves Signal. She's on Signal. We have a whole family group chat on Signal, and she loves it and trusts it and love that no matter what phone or what place, I have a huge family and we're all over the world. She knows it's like a safe way to communicate, right? Apple Messages would not work for her,
Yeah.
And the fact that she can run any app she chooses, and we can all be there, and all of her kids and grandkids are there safely together, privately, makes her happy. So I think, that's all she thinks about is this, will this gadget do the thing I want it to do and that I paid for it? And I would say that to your grandmother as well. I mean, I'm sure she has some sense of sovereignty, control over her stuff.
Yeah.
This idea that we don't own anything anymore and that anything can change at any time and we really don't have any control is really disempowering, especially for the older generation who remembers when it wasn't that way.
That's a great point. Anything to add, Valentin?
Same here. My whole family is on Signal. So it's also just a cognitive way of, giving people a story to the products they're using, right? It's a secure product, and it's also just one of the good examples that you mentioned earlier. And what's important as well is that these products, which provide security for human rights defenders, but also for our families, are easy to use as well. Because my grandmother, one which I still have, is not very tech savvy, but these products are very, very easy to access and to communicate with. So I think that's a key point as well.
Great. Well, thank you both for your expertise, for your incredible work, and for taking time out of your busy schedule